So this is the start of another plywood-based cabinet project. You could see the sister project I was working on at the same time as being painted behind it. And in this video, we're going to go through making the main carcass for this. I think this series will only be 2 parts. These smaller plywood cabinets are pretty quick builds in my shop at this point, and there's really no bells and whistles to this one. She wanted everything kind of plain and flat, no detailing. So basically, I'm going to start with a basic cut list. This is another project where I drew up a drawing for the customer. So as much as I don't like computer work, some of these projects where drawings are kind of nice because you spend all the time doing the drawing, and then I could just automatically transfer all the dimensions on that drawing to the shop without doing any sort of math in the shop. So this was one of those projects where I could just eke by with one sheet of plywood. So you could see before I started piecing this stuff out, I used a chalk line just to lay it out as best as possible so I could get away with one piece, and I just went through and ripped down all of my widths, and then you could see I cut everything on the radial arm saw to size, and then I could start adding rabbet and dados. So that bottom piece was the base. It's going to have one dado in it because I'm going to have a taller vertical cabinet basically next to a shorter horizontal cabinet, because this is going to also be a bench, and I wanted it all to be one piece. I didn't want to make 2 cabinets and screw them together. So basically pretty simple stuff. If you want to make something like this, I might eventually get around to getting some of these plans online, but if you pause on the video with my cut list, you can get a basic idea of this. Now if you are building something like this, what I like to do is I like to cut to my widths and then cut as I go. If your dimensions are a little different than my dimensions, if you go through and cut all of your pieces at first, things might not line up. But as you can see on the verticals, I have everything mapped out. I'm basically cutting rabbets on the back because I like to put backers on all of this stuff, and I like to set them in rabbets. And then the top side of this cabinet is a little bit different. It has a shelf at the top. She kind of wanted a ledge around the whole thing. I believe this is mainly going to be something her daughter uses to put all of her school supplies in, backpack, shoes, whatnot, and can sit on it and get ready before she goes to school. So that's kind of basically the design. And you could see I'm going through and just adding all those pieces. Because it's a taller cabinet next to a shorter cabinet, all of these cuts will make a little bit more sense once you see it set up. But basically wherever I have an intersecting piece of material, I'm putting a dado. Now on the shorter edge, this is a little bit different than what I usually do, because the essentially where the bench is going to be a rabbet cut on that edge, but I don't want a plywood top. I believe she's going to be putting a cushion on this, but I still didn't want to deal with covering up that ply. So before I cut the rabbet, I just put a piece of poplar on top, set it in place with some brads. I let it dry for about 20 minutes, and then I can cut that rabbet. You can see that's what I'm doing here. So when it comes time to finish it, that edge has a finished edge versus the ply. Now you could fill in plywood, I've done that before, but it's a little bit easier with poplar. And then this is basically where we're at. You can see I have dados and rabbets to join my horizontal pieces, and basically my verticals had 2 rabbets on the bottoms, and then one dado in the base for that one vertical. So pretty simple stuff, especially once you're already working off of a drawing. I could go through and add my top, and then at this point was kind of where it gets a little fun, because these taller verticals, plywood's not perfectly flat. So I had put that topper in, and it was getting a little hard getting it square. I was using 2 squares to kind of line everything up, and it wasn't really working. So what I decided to do was cut the backer for this, use the backer to square up this vertical cabinet, and then fit that top piece. Usually I cut the backer at the end of a project, but I use it to square up the base, and on this I was going to use it to square it up to cut my other pieces. Now on this one I'm cutting a 1/2 inch backer, and that is because, like I said, it's going to be a bench, so there is going to be weight on this. You could probably get away with a 1/4 inch, but for this I decided to use a 1/2 inch backer just to beef it up. And then you can see I could put that backer in place. It's much easier to square up this cabinet. At this point I could clamp everything in place, get a more accurate measurement for that top. I was off by a little bit. I could trim it down and then fit everything into place. So now for this horizontal portion, you could see my verticals go past the base to account for that 1/2 inch backer, but I had to remove a little piece of this backside rabbet in order to add the backer to the horizontal piece. I did that pretty quickly on the table saw. I could cut practically to my line and then just finish it up with a handsaw, and then once it's popped back into place, you'll see how now the backer for the horizontal bench part will now fit along this backside vertical as well. So that's it in place. You can see how the taller vertical backer fits inside that rabbet, and now I could fit this one in place as well. This is one of those things that I figured out the mechanics of it in the drawing, which was kind of nice, and then in the shop I knew that that was going to be an issue and can tackle it then. So then once that's in place, once again I can measure everything squared up. I can measure and add this last little bit of ply, and that is the basic carcass for this. Now I'm going to go through and cut splines in the front of this. There's a lot of moving pieces at this point. Everything's not a single piece of this is the same dimension, so I just mark the front so when I go to cut the splines I know they're in the front. And while I had everything dry fit, I put screws in the back and screws on the bottom, all places where you won't see them, so when it comes time to glue everything together, all of my screw alignment holes will kind of put everything back in place with the glue, which is handy. On paint grade projects like this, you can add screws on the outside, but it's all stuff you're gonna have to cover up, so I try and keep them hidden, unlike built-ins where usually you could screw whatever you want on the sides because you won't see them. So then to cut the splines, it's all going to be poplar. I just ripped 3/4 inch strips of poplar off of a board, and then I'm going to use my tall fence because I'm going to cut the grooves in the poplar and the grooves in my plywood at the same time. A 1/4 inch dado stack in there, and as you can see I cut the grooves in the poplar, didn't move anything, and I could cut the grooves in the plywood. Doing it this way means this groove doesn't have to be perfectly centered because they're all going to be oriented the same way, being cut with the same setup on the table saw. So if you're doing it this way and you don't want to deal with really zeroing in on making everything perfect, as long as you cut all those grooves at the same time, you can flip that poplar in order to make it work. So then the spline material is just going to be 1/4 inch ply. I go about a 1/2 inch into the ply, a 1/2 inch into the poplar, so I'm cutting about an inch piece of this spline material. I just check to make sure everything fits before cutting it all up. This usually works out pretty well because I have random scraps of plywood in the shop, so a great way to use up pieces that can't really be utilized for anything else is by turning them into splines. And then I could start gluing this up. This was a little more of a complicated glue up because of the fact that it's just not symmetrical. There's multiple intersecting parts and shapes. So what I decided to do, like I said, I already had these holes, so I had the ones on the bottom of the ply to hold that one vertical. I could slowly reattach everything. So you can see I'm attaching that bottom. Once that was done, I could lay it on my table and put this shelf in the middle. You could get a good idea of what those splines look like reattaching this, and then I could go and attach this other vertical. Doing it this way was a little bit easier to line everything up. I only have about 20 to 25 minutes before this glue starts to set up, so I do have to move quickly, but once these pieces are in place, I kind of bradded that corner because brads are a little bit easier to fill than screws, and then I could clamp it on my table and keep working around. So at this point I could put the backer in place, and like I said, this is where those pre-drilled screw holes come into place. Now the screws aren't really necessarily for structure as much as I'm using them as essentially clamps to hold everything together while the glue sets. This glue is going to be strong enough to hold this whole piece together without hardware, but like I said, the screws essentially are going to help pull all those pieces together and hold them in place as that wood dries, which is why I use drywall screws for this. They're cheap, they're inexpensive, and they're not, like I said, necessarily for structure. I could take them out after this, and this will still have the same strength without them. Then you can see I could put that horizontal in, that side piece in, and then set the backer in place, and then let everything dry in those clamps. Now while it's drying, I could put my face frame on. These are going to be inset doors with European style cabinet hinges. So basically the face frame is just covering the ply. It's going to be the same thickness as the ply. Wherever I have intersecting pieces, I have to remove a little bit of that plywood material because the plywood sinks into the dado. You could see I just remove it with a saw, and then I could just work my way around the carcass. I dry fit the face frame in place, and then I'll go through and add glue and brads. I don't think I have footage of that because my camera kind of died during this process of filming, but essentially it's exactly what I'm showing here. Just at the end I remove all this, add glue, and put brads in place. And you can see how I move my way around the frame, attaching all of the pieces. So pretty simple stuff. The poplar is going to be a little bit thicker than the ply. The ply is more like 23-30 seconds. The poplar is 3/4, but that's nice. If there's any undulations, I just sand everything flush. And then next week we'll be adding doors and shelves and that base, and finishing it up. Pretty quick project.